The armory fell silent, except for the soft click of metal against metal, as Paige Lawson methodically returned each rifle to its designated rack. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, each weapon handled with the kind of reverence that spoke of years spent understanding their deadly potential. But when Captain Rodriguez glanced down at the ID card she'd left on his desk, his blood turned to ice. There, stamped in faded red ink across the back, were the words that made his hands tremble. Codename, Crosswind, 302 confirmed. That designation belonged to a ghost, a legend whispered about in the darkest corners of military intelligence, a sniper who'd been officially erased from existence after a mission so classified that even mentioning it could end careers. As Paige calmly walked back to retrieve her forgotten identification, Rodriguez realized he was staring at someone who wasn't supposed to exist, someone whose very presence in his armory meant that the shadows of the past were stirring once again. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the underground armory of Fort Harrison, casting harsh shadows between the rows of weapon racks that stretched into the dimly lit depths of the facility. Specialist Paige Lawson moved through her assigned duties with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her practically invisible to the bustling activity of the base. At 28, she possessed an unremarkable appearance that served her well. Average height, with brown hair pulled back in regulation style. Her uniform crisp, but not attention-grabbing. What most people noticed, if they noticed her at all, was the way she carried herself with an almost feline grace, each step deliberate and silent, despite the concrete floor beneath her boots. Captain Marcus Rodriguez had been running the armory for 3 years, and in that time he'd grown accustomed to the rotating cast of personnel assigned to help maintain the vast collection of weapons under his charge. Some were eager rookies, looking to prove themselves. Others were seasoned soldiers, marking time until their next deployment. Paige Lawson fell into neither category. She'd appeared on his roster 6 weeks ago, with minimal paperwork, a transfer from some administrative position that he barely glanced at before approving. She did her work without complaint, shown up early, stayed late when needed, and never caused problems. In the military, such reliability was worth its weight in gold. This particular evening found the armory in its usual state of controlled chaos. The day shift had logged dozens of weapons out for training exercises, and now the night crew was tasked with receiving them back, conducting inspections, cleaning when necessary, and returning everything to its proper place. The system was methodical, designed by years of military precision to ensure that every rifle, every pistol, every piece of equipment could be accounted for at a moment's notice. Paige worked her way down the third row of rifle racks, her fingers dancing over each weapon with practiced familiarity. She checked serial numbers against her clipboard, verified condition reports, and slotted each rifle into its designated position, with movements so fluid they seemed almost rehearsed. The M4 carbines hung in perfect alignment, their black polymer stocks gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Each rifle had its own story, its own history of training exercises and deployments, but to most people they were simply tools of the trade. To Paige, however, each weapon spoke volumes. The slight wear on a grip indicated a left-handed shooter. The particular pattern of carbon buildup in a barrel suggested someone who favored rapid fire over precision shots. The way a scope had been adjusted revealed the preferences of its last user. These details flowed through her consciousness without conscious thought, the way a musician might notice the subtle variations in pitch between different instruments in an orchestra. Captain Rodriguez sat at his desk in a glass-walled office that overlooked the main armory floor, buried in the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply with each passing day. Requisition forms, maintenance reports, personnel evaluations, and security briefings created towers of documents that threatened to overwhelm his metal desk. He'd learned to manage the administrative burden by staying late most evenings, working through the quiet hours when his mind could focus without the constant interruptions of the day shift. The captain was a career soldier, 22 years in service with deployments across 3 continents. He'd earned his stripes the hard way, through competence and dedication rather than political connections or family influence. At 41, he still maintained the lean physique of a man who took physical fitness seriously. Though the stress of command had added lines around his eyes, and threads of gray to his dark hair. His office reflected his personality, sparse but organized, with commendations and unit photos covering one wall and technical manuals filling the bookshelf behind his desk. As Paige continued her methodical work, she allowed her mind to drift to the careful routine she'd established since arriving at Fort Harrison. Wake at 0500, physical training until 0630, shower and breakfast, then report to the armory for whatever tasks Captain Rodriguez had assigned. Lunch at the mess hall, always sitting alone with a book or technical manual, then back to work until the day shift ended. Evenings were spent in her barracks quarters, a small room she'd kept deliberately Spartan, with only the basic furnishings and a few personal items that revealed nothing about her past. The routine served multiple purposes. It made her predictable, unremarkable, just another soldier going through the motions of military life. It also provided structure in a world where structure meant survival. Most importantly, it allowed her to observe, without being observed, to learn the rhythms and patterns of the base while keeping her own secrets safely buried. Tonight felt different, though she couldn't quite identify why. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed deeper between the weapon racks, or the unusual quiet that had settled over the facility. Most of the day staff had departed earlier than usual, leaving only a skeleton crew to handle the evening duties. Captain Rodriguez remained in his office, as he often did, but even he seemed more focused on his paperwork than his usual supervisory rounds. Paige completed the third rack and moved on to the fourth, her clipboard growing heavier with completed inspection forms. Each rifle required a specific sequence of checks: visual inspection for obvious damage, verification of serial number against the sign-out log, confirmation that all accessories were present and accounted for, and finally a brief function check to ensure the weapon's crack. Mechanisms operated smoothly. The process had become second nature, allowing her conscious mind to remain alert, while her hands performed the familiar tasks. The fourth rack contained the older weapons, mostly M16A2 rifles that had seen better days, but remained serviceable for training purposes. These rifles held more character than their newer counterparts, bearing the scuffs and wear patterns that spoke of decades of faithful service. Some had been carried through jumble training exercises, others had endured desert maneuvers or Arctic survival courses. Each weapon carried the invisible traces of the soldiers who had depended on it. As she worked, Paige's enhanced hearing picked up the subtle sounds that most people missed. The gentle hum of the ventilation system cycling through its programmed routine. The distant rumble of a supply truck making its evening rounds. The soft scrape of Captain Rodriguez's pen against paper as he signed document after document. The almost inaudible whisper of her own breathing, controlled and steady despite the growing tension she couldn't quite explain. Captain Rodriguez glanced up from his paperwork, his eyes automatically scanning the armory floor as he'd been trained to do. Security was paramount in his line of work, and constant vigilance had become an ingrained habit. He noted Paige's position near the fourth rack, her methodical progress through the evening's tasks, the orderly state of the completed sections. Everything appeared normal, routine, exactly as it should be on a quiet Tuesday evening. He returned his attention to the requisition form in front of him, a request for replacement parts for the M2049 light machine guns used by the base's training units. The paperwork required his signature in 3 places, along with justifications for the expense and projected delivery dates. Such administrative details consumed far more of his time than he'd expected when accepting the armory assignment, but he'd learned to find satisfaction in the knowledge that his attention to detail kept the bases by weapons in peak condition. The sound of Paige's movement had become a comfortable background rhythm, the soft whisper of her boots against the concrete floor mixing with the gentle sounds of her work. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of extensive training, though he couldn't recall seeing any special qualifications in her personnel file. Perhaps she'd simply developed efficiency through repetition, the way many soldiers did when faced with routine tasks. Paige reached the end of the fourth rack and paused to check her progress against the duty roster. According to her calculations, she was ahead of schedule, which would allow her to spend extra time on the more complex weapons in the fifth section. The sniper rifles and designated marksman weapons required more detailed inspections, partly because of their precision requirements and partly because they saw less frequent use than the standard infantry weapons. The fifth rack stood in a slightly more isolated section of the armory, separated from the main floor by a chain-link partition that required keycard access. Captain Rodriguez had provided her with the necessary clearance on her second day, noting that her background check had come back clean and her work performance exceeded expectations. The area contained the base's collection of precision weapons, M24 sniper weapon systems, M110 semi-automatic sniper systems, and a few specialized rifles used for long-range training scenarios. As Paige approached the security door, she noticed that her keycard wasn't in its usual position on her belt. A quick mental inventory revealed that she'd left it on Captain Rodriguez's desk when she'd signed in for her shift. Such oversights were unusual for her, another sign that something about this evening felt different from the established routine. She walked back toward the office, her footsteps silent despite the urgency of retrieving her access card. Captain Rodriguez looked up as she approached, noting her purposeful stride and the slight frown that creased her forehead. He'd learned to read the body language of his personnel, a skill that helped him anticipate problems before they became serious issues. "Forgot something?" he asked, gesturing toward the desk where her keycard lay beside a small stack of completed inspection forms. "Access card," Paige replied, her voice carrying the neutral tone she'd perfected over months of careful practice. "Need to finish the precision weapons section." Captain Rodriguez nodded and returned to his paperwork, dismissing the interaction as routine. Paige's hand closed around her keycard, and she turned to leave, but in her haste, she knocked over the small plastic holder that contained her military identification card. The ID fell face down on the desk, landing beside the captain's open logbook with a soft plastic click that seemed unusually loud in the quiet office. Neither of them immediately moved to retrieve it. Captain Rodriguez was absorbed in calculating the cost projections for his requisition request, while Paige had already taken several steps toward the security door before realizing what had happened. In that moment of inattention, fate arranged itself around a piece of plastic no larger than a credit card. The captain finished his calculation and reached for his coffee cup, his peripheral vision catching sight of the fallen ID card. Military protocol and simple courtesy dictated that he should either call Paige back or set the card aside where she could easily find it. Instead, some unconscious instinct made him pause, his hand hovering over the identification as he noticed something unusual about its appearance. Most military ID cards were identical in their basic design, following strict standards that had been refined over decades. Photo on the front, basic information clearly displayed, holographic security features to prevent counterfeiting. This card looked correct from the front, but the back showed signs of additional markings that weren't part of the standard format. Captain Rodriguez picked up the card, telling himself he was simply ensuring it hadn't been damaged in the fall. The front displayed Paige's photograph, her rank and unit designation, all perfectly normal and consistent with the information in her personnel file. But when he turned the card over, his blood pressure spiked as he read the faded red stamp that someone had applied across the standard text. Codename, Crosswind, 302 confirmed. The coffee cup slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, splashing its contents across his desk and soaking into the papers he'd been working on for the past hour. But Captain Rodriguez barely noticed the mess, as his mind struggled to process the implications of what he was seeing. The designation, Crosswind, wasn't just any code name. It belonged to a legend, a ghost story whispered among intelligence personnel and special operations veterans. According to the stories, Crosswind had been a sniper, possibly the most effective long-range eliminator the military had ever produced. The number following the codename supposedly indicated confirmed kills, though the actual criteria for confirmation remained classified at levels far above Rodriguez's security clearance. 302 confirmed eliminations would make Crosswind one of the most lethal snipers in military history, surpassing even the legendary figures from previous conflicts. But here was the problem. Crosswind wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The stories all agreed on one point, that the sniper had been involved in some kind of classified operation that had gone wrong, resulting in the complete erasure of their records from official military databases. Crosswind had become what the intelligence community called a black hole, a person whose existence had been systematically removed from all official documentation. Captain Rodriguez's hands trembled as he stared at the ID card, his mind racing through the implications. If this was authentic, then Paige Lawson wasn't who she claimed to be. She was either an extremely dangerous individual operating under false identity, or she was someone whose real identity had been buried so deeply that even her current military service was part of. Elaborate cover story. The sound of the security door opening snapped him back to the present moment. Paige had accessed the restricted section and was presumably continuing her work among the precision weapons. Rodriguez looked down at the ID card in his hands, then at the coffee-soaked papers on his desk, trying to decide on his next course of action. Military protocol demanded that he report the discovery immediately, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the way Paige had conducted herself over the past 6 weeks, her quiet competence and obvious familiarity with military weapons and procedures. Perhaps it was the nagging sense that there were forces at work far above his pay grade, and that making the wrong move could have consequences he couldn't anticipate. Or perhaps it was simple curiosity about who this woman really was, and why she'd ended up assigned to his armory. In the restricted section, Paige worked with the same methodical precision she'd demonstrated with the standard weapons, but her movements carried an additional layer of reverence when handling the sniper rifles. Each weapon represented the pinnacle of firearms engineering, designed for accuracy and reliability under the most demanding conditions. The M24, with its Remington 700 action and loopholed scope, had been the standard for military snipers for decades. The M110, a semi-automatic platform, offered faster follow-up shots at the cost of some precision. But it was the custom rifles that drew her attention, weapons that had been hand-built for specific missions or specialized training programs. One rifle in particular seemed to call to her, a heavily modified platform that bore no manufacturer's markings, but showed the telltale signs of master craftsmanship. The stock had been shaped to fit a specific shooter's physique. The barrel was clearly custom manufactured to exacting specifications, and the scope was a piece of precision optics that cost more than most soldiers earned in buy. 6 months. Paige's fingers traced the rifle's contours with unconscious familiarity, her muscle memory responding to shapes and textures that felt like extensions of her own body. The weapon's balance was perfect, the trigger pull precisely adjusted, every component optimized for maximum accuracy at extreme ranges. She could feel the ghost of countless hours spent in training, the memory of wind calculations and bullet drop compensations, the meditative focus required to place a shot with surgical precision. For a moment, the careful walls she'd built around her past began to crack, allowing fragments of memory to surface. The weight of a rifle in her hands during a pre-dawn insertion, the view through a scope as she tracked a target across impossible distances, the controlled breathing and steady heartbeat that preceded the moment of truth. The satisfaction of a perfect shot, followed immediately by the mechanical process of extraction and exfiltration. But she forced those memories back into their locked compartments, reminding herself of the new identity she'd constructed and the reason she needed to maintain it. Paige Lawson was a supply specialist with an unremarkable record and no unusual skills. She was not the person who had once earned the codename Crosswind, and she could never allow herself to become that person again. Captain Rodriguez sat in his office, the ID card still clutched in his sweating palm, as he tried to decide between duty and discretion. Every instinct told him to pick up the phone and report his discovery to the base security office, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the recognition that Paige had done nothing wrong during her time at his facility. She'd been professional, competent, and reliable. If she was hiding something, she'd given no indication of hostile intent. The captain's military career had taught him to trust his instincts, and those instincts were sending mixed signals. The logical part of his mind insisted that someone operating under false identity represented a potential security threat. But the intuitive part recognized something in Paige's demeanor that suggested she was exactly what she appeared to be, a soldier trying to do her job without drawing attention to herself. He thought about the way she handled weapons, with a familiarity that went beyond basic military training. He remembered the casual competence with which she diagnosed a malfunction in one of the M2049s, spotting a problem that had escaped the attention of more experienced armorers. There had been moments when her guard had slipped slightly, revealing flashes of knowledge and capability that didn't match her official records. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his internal debate. Rodriguez quickly shoved the ID card into his desk drawer, his heart pounding as he realized that Paige was returning from the restricted section. He grabbed a handful of napkins from his desk drawer and began cleaning up the spilled coffee, trying to appear normally occupied when she entered his office. Paige appeared in the doorway, her inspection clipboard tucked under one arm, and her face carrying the slight satisfaction of completed work. She'd finished ahead of schedule, as usual, and was ready to file her reports and conclude her shift. But as she stepped into the office, her trained senses immediately picked up on the captain's elevated stress levels. The spilled coffee was obvious, but there were other signs that something had disturbed the normal routine. Rodriguez's posture was too rigid, his movements too controlled, his breathing slightly elevated. The air in the office carried the chemical signature of adrenaline, barely perceptible but unmistakable to someone trained to read such signs. Most telling of all was the captain's unwillingness to meet her eyes directly, a behavior pattern that suggested guilt or anxiety about something he'd discovered. Paige's mind began calculating possibilities and responses, her operational training reasserting itself despite her efforts to remain in character. If her cover had been compromised, she needed to assess the threat level and determine her options. Captain Rodriguez was a career soldier with no special operations background, which meant he posed minimal physical threat, but could become a significant security risk if he reported his suspicions to the wrong people. "Rough evening, Captain?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral as she gestured toward the coffee-soaked papers on his desk. "Just clumsy," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor that contradicted his words. "You know how it is. Long day, tired hands." Paige nodded sympathetically while her eyes quickly scanned the office for anything out of place. Her gaze fell on the desk where she'd left her ID card, noting immediately that it was no longer visible. The implications hit her like a physical blow, though she allowed no change in her expression to betray the sudden surge of adrenaline that flooded her system. "I think I dropped my ID when I grabbed my access card," she said, stepping closer to the desk with movements that appeared casual but positioned her within striking distance if the situation deteriorated. Captain Rodriguez's hand instinctively moved toward his desk drawer, the unconscious gesture confirming Paige's suspicions about where her identification had ended up. For a moment, the two of them existed in a bubble of tension, each aware that the other knew more than they were saying, each calculating the potential consequences of their next words. "Right here," Rodriguez said finally, opening the drawer and retrieving the ID card. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed it to her, their eyes meeting briefly in a moment of mutual recognition. Whatever he'd seen on that card had changed everything between them, and they both knew it. Paige accepted the ID with steady hands, her fingers briefly brushing against the captain's in a contact that lasted exactly long enough for her to assess his pulse rate and stress level. He was frightened, but not immediately hostile, which gave her options beyond the violent solutions that would have been her first resort in other circumstances. "Thank you," she said simply, tucking the card into her uniform pocket without examining it. There was no point in pretending she didn't know what he'd seen, but acknowledging it directly would force them both into positions from which retreat might be impossible. Captain Rodriguez watched her face carefully, looking for some sign of the legendary sniper he now suspected her of being. But Paige's expression remained perfectly neutral, giving away nothing beyond polite gratitude for the return of her property. If not for the evidence he'd seen with his own eyes, he might have convinced himself that he'd imagined the entire incident. "The precision weapons section is complete," Paige reported, offering him her clipboard with the completed inspection forms. "Everything checks out normal. No maintenance issues to report." The captain accepted the clipboard with hands that had steadied somewhat, though his pulse remained elevated. The mundane nature of their exchange felt surreal, given the magnitude of what he suspected about her true identity. Here they were, discussing routine maintenance reports, while dancing around the possibility that she was one of the most dangerous individuals he'd ever encountered. "Good work," he managed, his voice sounding more normal than he felt. "Same time tomorrow?" "Yes, sir," Paige replied, then turned and walked toward the office door with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained throughout the evening. Her footsteps were silent against the concrete floor, a detail that Rodriguez now recognized as significant rather than simply professional. As she reached the doorway, Paige paused and looked back over her shoulder. For just a moment, her carefully constructed facade slipped, revealing something in her eyes that made the captain's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't threat or warning, but rather a kind of weary recognition, as if she was acknowledging that they'd crossed a line from which there might be no return. "Captain," she said softly, her voice carrying undertones that hadn't been there before. "Some things are better left buried, for everyone's sake." Then she was gone, disappearing into the shadowy depths of the armory with footsteps so quiet they might have been imagined. Captain Rodriguez sat alone in his office, surrounded by coffee-stained papers and the lingering scent of gun oil, trying to process what had just occurred. The rational part of his mind insisted that he should pick up the phone and report everything he'd learned to base security. A person operating under false identity, particularly one with the implied background of someone designated Crosswind, represented exactly the kind of security threat that military protocol was designed to address. But as he reached for the telephone, something held him back. Perhaps it was the memory of her final words, spoken with a quiet intensity that suggested she understood consequences far better than he did. Perhaps it was the recognition that there were levels of classification and operational security that existed far above his clearance level, and that interfering with whatever was happening could have repercussions he couldn't anticipate. Or perhaps it was something simpler, the gut-level conviction that Paige Lawson, whatever her real name and background might be, posed no threat to him or his facility. She'd had 6 weeks to cause problems if that had been her intent, and instead, she'd been a model soldier, competent and reliable in every aspect of her duties. Captain Rodriguez picked up his coffee-stained requisition forms and began the tedious process of retyping them. But his mind kept returning to the implications of what he'd discovered. If Paige was indeed the sniper known as Crosswind, then her presence at Fort Harrison was no accident. Someone with significant authority had arranged for her to be assigned to his armory, complete with identity documents sophisticated enough to pass routine security checks. The question was why. Was she hiding from something? Or was she positioned here for some purpose he couldn't fathom? Were there other people on the base who knew her real identity? Or was he the first to accidentally stumble across her secret? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do with the knowledge now that he possessed it? Meanwhile, Paige made her way through the empty corridors of the base, her mind automatically cataloging exit routes and potential threats while she processed the evening's developments. Captain Rodriguez's discovery of her ID card represented a significant compromise of her operational security, but not necessarily a fatal one. The man was career military rather than intelligence, which meant he was likely to be cautious about reporting something he didn't fully understand. Still, the incident served as a stark reminder that her current situation was inherently unstable. She'd been living on borrowed time since arriving at Fort Harrison, using an identity that couldn't withstand serious scrutiny indefinitely. Sooner or later, someone would ask the wrong questions or notice the inconsistencies that careful examination would reveal. The ID card with its damning designation had been a calculated risk from the beginning. She could have obtained completely clean documentation, but doing so would have required her to sever all connections to her previous life and accept that she could never reclaim her real identity. Instead, she'd chosen to keep a single piece of evidence, a tangible link to the person she'd once been, even knowing that its discovery could destroy the careful facade she'd constructed. As she entered her barracks quarters, Paige allowed herself to consider the possibility that her time as a supply specialist might be coming to an end. Captain Rodriguez might decide that duty required him to report his discovery, despite her subtle warning about leaving some things buried. If that happened, she'd have perhaps 12 hours before security personnel came looking for answers she couldn't provide without revealing secrets that were meant to stay hidden. The room around her was sparse and impersonal, containing only the basic furnishings provided by the military and a few carefully chosen personal items that supported her cover identity. A small bookshelf held technical manuals and popular fiction, the kind of reading material that would be expected from someone with her supposed background. Her dresser contained regulation uniforms and civilian clothes appropriate for an off-duty soldier of modest means. But hidden in a concealed compartment behind the room's ventilation grate were items that told a different story. An encrypted satellite phone that could reach numbers most people didn't know existed. A collection of identification documents that would allow her to disappear completely if circumstances required it. And a small leather pouch containing medals and commendations earned under her real name, awards that officially no longer existed, but remained precious to her nonetheless. Paige sat on the edge of her narrow bed and considered her options. She could disappear that very night, using her hidden resources to create a new identity in a different location far from Fort Harrison. The process would be straightforward, requiring only a few phone calls and a careful exit strategy that would leave no traces for anyone to follow. Alternatively, she could maintain her current position and hope that Captain Rodriguez would choose discretion over duty. The man seemed fundamentally decent, and her assessment of his character suggested that he might be willing to let sleeping dogs lie if he believed that doing so served the greater good. But relying on another person's judgment was a gamble that went against everything she'd been trained to believe about operational security. As she weighed these options, Paige found herself thinking about the life she'd built over the past 6 weeks. It wasn't much, just a routine job in a modest quarters, but it represented something she'd thought was lost forever: normalcy. For the first time since her world had collapsed around her, she'd experienced what it meant to be just another soldier doing her job without the weight of impossible expectations or the burden of secrets that could never be shared. The identity of Paige Lawson might be artificial, but the satisfaction she'd found in competent work and simple routines was real. She'd discovered that there was dignity in ordinary tasks performed well, and peace in a life where her greatest concern was whether the weapon inventories balanced correctly at the end of each shift. But perhaps most importantly, she'd begun to remember who she'd been before the missions and the classifications and the gradual transformation into someone known only by a code name. Beneath the legend of Crosswind was a person who'd once had hopes and dreams beyond the next target, someone who'd joined the military to serve her country rather than to become a ghost that couldn't officially exist. The question now was whether she was willing to fight for that rediscovered sense of self, or whether prudence demanded that she return to the shadows where legends belonged. As she prepared for what might be her last night at Fort Harrison, Paige found herself hoping that Captain Rodriguez would prove to be the kind of man who understood that some secrets were worth keeping. In his office, Captain Rodriguez continued working through his paperwork, but his concentration was thoroughly broken by the evening's revelations. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the armory floor where Paige had worked with such quiet competence, trying to reconcile the ordinary soldier he'd observed with the legendary figure he now suspected her of being. The stories about Crosswind were fragmentary and probably exaggerated, the kind of whispered legends that accumulated around anyone who operated in the classified world of special operations. But certain elements appeared consistently across different versions. Impossible shots made under extreme conditions, targets eliminated at ranges that stretched the boundaries of what modern equipment could achieve, and a perfect record of mission completion that had made the sniper invaluable to certain types of operations. Then, something had gone wrong. The details were never clear, but every story agreed that Crosswind had been involved in a mission that resulted in the sniper's complete erasure from official records. Some versions claimed it was a matter of political sensitivity, others suggested that classified techniques had been compromised, and still others hinted at moral complications that made continued acknowledgement impossible. Rodriguez found himself wondering what could drive someone with Crosswind's alleged skills to accept assignment to a routine armory position. Was she hiding from enemies, or had she simply chosen to disappear rather than continue in a role that had cost her more than she was willing to pay? The woman he'd worked with for 6 weeks showed no signs of the psychological damage that might be expected from someone with 300 confirmed kills. But then again, someone capable of achieving that level of lethality would necessarily be expert at concealing their true nature. The captain's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of his relief officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who'd been assigned to cover the overnight shift. Chen was young and enthusiastic, The kind of officer who took her responsibilities seriously and arrived early for every assignment. Her presence reminded Rodriguez that the normal world of military routine continued regardless of the personal crisis he was experiencing. "Evening, Captain," Chen said briskly, setting her coffee cup on a clear section of his desk and beginning the standard shift change procedures. "Anything unusual to report?" Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, acutely aware that this was the perfect opportunity to share his discovery with someone who would certainly report it through proper channels. Lieutenant Chen was ambitious and by the book, exactly the kind of officer who would view the revelation about Paige's identity as a career-making intelligence coup. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Specialist Lawson finished the precision weapons inspection ahead of schedule, all equipment accounted for and secured. Chen nodded and made a note in her logbook, then launched into her usual briefing about overnight security procedures and maintenance schedules. Rodriguez listened with half his attention while the other half grappled with the implications of his decision to keep Paige's secret. By failing to report what he'd learned, he was potentially compromising base security and certainly violating his oath to follow proper procedures. But as he gathered his things and prepared to leave the armory, Rodriguez found that he felt more at peace with his choice than he'd expected. Sometimes doing the right thing required looking beyond regulations and procedures to consider the human consequences of one's actions. If Paige Lawson was indeed the legendary Crosswind, then she'd already paid whatever price her past required, and forcing her back into that world might serve no one's interests except those of people who viewed soldiers as expendable assets rather than human beings. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look slightly depressing. Paige woke at her usual time and went through her established routine, but every movement carried the awareness that this might be her last day as a supply specialist at Fort Harrison. She'd spent much of the night listening for the sound of vehicles that might indicate security personnel coming to investigate Captain Rodriguez's discovery, but the base had remained quiet except for the normal sounds of shift changes and routine patrols. During her morning physical training, she found herself paying closer attention to the base's layout and security procedures, automatically calculating escape routes and defensive positions in case her situation deteriorated suddenly. The habits of operational thinking were deeply ingrained, surfacing whenever she felt threatened despite her efforts to suppress them. At breakfast, she sat in her usual corner table with a technical manual propped against her coffee cup. But the words on the page failed to register as her mind remained focused on more immediate concerns. Around her, the mess hall buzzed with the normal conversations of soldiers beginning their day. Complaints about upcoming training exercises, gossip about personnel transfers, speculation about weekend liberty schedules. The mundane nature of their concerns struck her as both precious and fragile. These people were living normal lives within the protective structure of military routine, unaware that their world could be shattered by decisions made far above their pay grade. She'd once been part of that world, back before her skills had attracted the attention of people who dealt in shadows and classified operations. When she reported to the armory, Paige found Captain Rodriguez already at his desk, working through a fresh stack of paperwork with apparent normalcy. He looked up as she entered, their eyes meeting briefly in a moment of mutual assessment. Neither spoke about the previous evening, but the tension between them was palpable, a shared awareness that their relationship had fundamentally changed. "Morning, Specialist," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying only the slightest tremor. "Standard inventory rotation today. 3rd and 4th sections need complete overhaul." "Understood, sir," Paige replied, accepting the work assignment with her usual professionalism. The tasks he'd outlined would keep her busy for most of the day, working in the more isolated sections of the armory, where they were unlikely to be interrupted by casual visitors. As she began her work, Paige found herself wondering whether the captain's assignment choices were coincidental or intentional. By keeping her in the remote sections, he was either providing her with privacy to work without scrutiny, or positioning her where she'd be easy to locate if security personnel came looking. Without knowing his intentions, she had to assume both possibilities were equally likely. The morning passed quietly, with Paige working through the familiar routines of weapon inspection and maintenance, while her heightened awareness monitored the sounds and rhythms of the facility around her. Captain Rodriguez made his usual rounds, checking on various personnel and reviewing completed work, but he seemed to be avoiding direct interaction with her beyond the minimum required by military courtesy. Around midday, the normal pattern was disrupted by the arrival of a visitor who didn't belong to the usual flow of base personnel. Paige heard the approaching footsteps before they became visible, her trained ear detecting the subtle differences in gait and boot type that distinguished this newcomer from the soldiers she'd grown accustomed to observing. The steps were measured and deliberate, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, but there was something else in the rhythm that made her internal alarms begin to sound. Colonel James Whitmore entered the armory with the bearing of a man who expected immediate attention and complete cooperation. He was in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of ramrod posture that spoke of decades in uniform. But his eyes held the calculating coldness that Paige recognized from her previous life. This was not a typical base commander making routine inspections. This was someone from the world of classified operations, the kind of person who dealt in assets and expendable resources rather than individual soldiers. Captain Rodriguez emerged from his office immediately, his body language shifting into the heightened alertness that junior officers displayed when confronted by senior brass, making unexpected visits. "Colonel Whitmore, sir. I wasn't expecting an inspection today." "This isn't an inspection, Captain," Whitmore replied, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm conducting a routine personnel review. I'll need to speak with each of your staff members individually." The words were spoken casually, that Paige's operational training allowed her to read between the lines. Personnel reviews didn't require colonels, and they certainly didn't happen without advance notice, unless there was a specific concern being investigated. Someone had reported something, or discovered something, that had triggered this visit. From her position in the fourth section, Paige could observe the interaction without being immediately visible to the newcomer. She continued her inventory work while every sense focused on gathering intelligence about this unexpected development. The colonel's uniform bore the insignia of military intelligence, but there were subtle details that suggested his actual affiliation lay with organizations that didn't advertise their existence on regulation uniforms. Captain Rodriguez was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, his earlier decision to keep Paige's secret now weighing heavily on his mind. The arrival of a colonel conducting unscheduled personnel reviews suggested that his choice to remain silent might have been the wrong one, or, alternatively, that forces beyond his control were already in motion. "Of course, sir," Rodriguez replied, his voice steady despite the tension Paige could detect in his posture. "Where would you like to conduct these reviews?" "Your office will suffice," Whitmore said, his gaze already scanning the armory floor with the systematic attention of someone cataloging potential threats and escape routes. "Let's start with your senior personnel and work down the chain." As the two officers disappeared into the glass-walled office, Paige found herself facing a decision that would determine the course of her immediate future. She could continue working and hope that whatever had triggered this visit wasn't specifically related to her presence at Fort Harrison. Alternatively, she could recognize that her time as Paige Lawson was likely coming to an end and begin implementing the contingency plans she'd prepared for exactly this situation. The sound of muffled conversation from the office provided no useful intelligence, but the body language visible through the glass walls told a clear story. Captain Rodriguez was answering questions while Colonel Whitmore took notes, their interaction following the familiar pattern of an interrogation disguised as an administrative review. Whatever the colonel was asking about, it was making the captain increasingly uncomfortable. Paige completed her current inspection checklist and moved closer to the office area, using the legitimate excuse of filing completed paperwork to position herself where she might overhear fragments of their conversation. Her enhanced hearing picked up occasional words and phrases that confirmed her worst suspicions. "Unusual qualifications," she heard the colonel say at one point, followed by Rodriguez's response about standard personnel assignments and routine background checks. Then Whitmore's voice again, asking about anomalous behavior patterns and specialized knowledge beyond stated credentials. The conversation was clearly building towards something specific, and Paige realized that she had perhaps minutes, rather than hours, to decide on her course of action. If she was going to disappear, It needed to happen before Colonel Whitmore completed his review of the senior staff and moved on to questioning the enlisted personnel. But as she weighed her options, something unexpected happened. The office door opened, and Captain Rodriguez emerged alone, his face bearing an expression of grim determination that hadn't been there when he'd entered. He walked directly toward her position with purposeful strides that suggested he'd made some kind of decision during his conversation with the colonel. "Specialist Lawson," he said quietly when he reached her position. "I need you to take an early lunch break. There's a situation developing that requires your immediate attention off base." The words were spoken in a normal conversational tone, but Paige detected the underlying message immediately. Rodriguez was giving her a warning and an opportunity to leave before Colonel Whitmore's investigation reached her name on the personnel roster. Whether this represented genuine concern for her welfare or simply a desire to avoid the complications her presence might create, it was a gesture of professional courtesy that she hadn't expected. "Understood, Captain," she replied, setting down her clipboard and beginning to gather her personal items with movements that appeared casual but were actually the first steps of an extraction protocol she'd hoped never class to use. "Any particular time frame for my return?" "Take all the time you need," Rodriguez said, his eyes meeting hers briefly in a look that conveyed more information than words could safely express. "I'll handle the afternoon inventory myself." Paige nodded and walked toward the exit, with the unhurried pace of someone heading to routine meal break, but every instinct was screaming at her to move faster. Once she cleared the armory's main entrance, she had perhaps 15 minutes before Colonel Whitmore would realize that one of the facility's personnel had conveniently disappeared just as his investigation was beginning. The walk across the base toward the parking area where she'd left her civilian vehicle felt like it took hours, though her watch indicated that only 3 minutes had passed. Every person she encountered might be the one who would remember seeing her leave at an unusual time, and every vehicle or building might conceal observers who would report her movements to the wrong people. Her car was a nondescript sedan, chosen specifically for its ability to blend into traffic without attracting attention. The vehicle contained a go bag hidden in the trunk, equipped with everything she'd need to disappear completely. Cash, alternative identification, basic supplies, and a clean cell phone that could contact the few people in the world who might help her in an emergency. As she started the engine and pulled out of the parking area, Paige caught sight of a black SUV with tinted windows approaching the armory building. The vehicle's occupants were invisible behind the darkened glass, but she recognized the make and model as standard transportation for security personnel conducting sensitive operations. Colonel Whitmore's personnel review was about to expand beyond simple questioning. Driving through the base's main gate, Paige felt a familiar mixture of relief and regret that had accompanied every extraction from compromised situations throughout her previous career. Relief at successfully escaping immediate danger, and regret at leaving behind another carefully constructed life that would now have to be abandoned completely. The security guard at the gate checked her identification with routine professionalism, noting her early departure, but finding nothing unusual about a soldier leaving for lunch break. In 30 minutes, that same guard would probably be questioned about everyone who'd left the base during the relevant time period, but by then, she'd be far enough away to avoid immediate pursuit. 20 miles from Fort Harrison, Paige pulled into a rest area and activated the encrypted satellite phone from her go bag. The device connected automatically to a communications network that officially didn't exist, routing her call through multiple relay points designed to prevent anyone from tracing the signal back to its source. After 3 rings, a voice answered with the neutral greeting she'd been expecting. "Switchboard. This is Crosswind," Paige said, using her operational code name for the first time in months. "I need immediate extraction and identity replacement. Code 7 scenario." There was a brief pause as the person on the other end processed her request and verified her identity through voice recognition protocols. Code 7 indicated compromise by friendly forces, requiring immediate evacuation and the assumption that all current operational assets were potentially blown. "Confirmed, Crosswind," the voice replied. "Extraction team will meet you at Rally Point Delta in 90 minutes. Prepare for extended relocation." The line went dead, leaving Paige alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that her experiment in normal life was definitively over. Rally Point Delta was a predetermined location where she could rendezvous with people who specialized in making problems disappear, but reaching it would require her to become someone else entirely. Paige Lawson would cease to exist as completely as if she'd never been born. Back at Fort Harrison, Colonel Whitmore was discovering that his carefully planned investigation had encountered an unexpected complication. The personnel file for Specialist Paige Lawson appeared perfectly normal on the surface, but when subjected to the kind of detailed analysis that his people specialized in, certain inconsistencies began to emerge. Her background check came back clean, Captain Rodriguez was explaining, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Standard military occupational specialty training, good performance evaluations, no disciplinary issues? Yes, Whitmore replied dryly. But her fingerprints don't match the ones on file with her original enlistment documents, and her social security number belongs to someone who died in a car accident 6 years ago. The revelation hit Rodriguez like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about the consequences of his decision to remain silent about Paige's suspicious identification card. By failing to report what he'd discovered, he'd allowed a person with fraudulent credentials to continue working in a sensitive position, potentially compromising base security and definitely violating his oath as an ex-off officer. I had no knowledge of any irregularities in her documentation, he said, which was technically true, even though it failed to address the larger issue of what he'd chosen not to investigate. Colonel Whitmore studied the captain's face with the practiced eye of someone trained to detect deception. Rodriguez was clearly uncomfortable, but his stress seemed more consistent with professional embarrassment than with active participation in whatever operation had placed a false identity within his facility. "Where is Specialist Lawson now?" Whitmore asked, consulting his watch and noting that their conversation had been proceeding for almost 30 minutes. "She took an early lunch break," Rodriguez replied, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "Said she'd be back this afternoon." The colonel's expression shifted into something approaching contempt. "Captain, I think we both know that Specialist Lawson won't be returning from her lunch break. The question is whether you aided her departure or simply failed to prevent it." Rodriguez remained silent, recognizing that anything he said at this point would either incriminate him further or reveal information about Paige that might endanger her safety. His military career was probably over, regardless of how this conversation concluded, but he could at least ensure that his mistakes didn't make her situation worse. Colonel Whitmore stood and walked to the office window, gazing out at the armory floor where other personnel continued their duties, unaware that their facility had been penetrated by someone operating under false tama. Identity. "The individual you knew as Paige Lawson is someone we've been looking for, Captain. Someone with skills and knowledge that make her extremely valuable to certain interests." "What kind of interests?" "What kind of interests?" Rodriguez asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "The kind that don't advertise their existence in official organizational charts," Whitmore replied. "The kind that view people like assets to be deployed rather than soldiers to be protected." The colonel's words carried an undertone that made Rodriguez's blood run cold. This wasn't a simple matter of military justice or security protocol. This was about people who operated in the spaces between official government activities, people who had the authority to make individuals disappear without leaving traces that could be investigated later. "She never caused any problems here," Rodriguez said, surprising himself with his willingness to defend someone who'd clearly been deceiving him for weeks. "Never compromised security or endangered personnel. That's not the point," Whitmore replied, turning back from the window with an expression that suggested the conversation was approaching its conclusion. "The point is that certain people invested considerable resources in training and equipping the individual you knew as Paige Lawson. When someone with that level of investment goes off the grid, recovery becomes a priority." Rodriguez felt a chill as he realized the implications of what the colonel was saying. They weren't looking for Paige to punish her for using false identification or to investigate potential security breaches. They were looking for her because they considered her their property, someone who couldn't be allowed to simply walk away from whatever classified world she'd once inhabited. "What happens now?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Now we expand the search," Whitmore said, moving toward the office door. We analyze her patterns, investigate her contacts, and use every available resource to locate her before she disappears so completely that recovery becomes impossible. As the colonel prepared to leave, Rodriguez found himself asking one final question. What if she doesn't want to be found? Whitmore paused in the doorway, his expression hardening into something that belonged in darker corners of human nature. Captain, people with her capabilities don't get to choose retirement. They're too valuable to their country, and too dangerous to everyone else. Whether she wants to be found is irrelevant. After the colonel departed, Rodriguez sat alone in his office, staring at the paperwork that had seemed so important just hours earlier. The normal concerns of inventory management and personnel evaluation felt trivial compared to the knowledge that he'd become an inadvertent participant in something far larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. He thought about Paige's final words the previous evening, her quiet warning that some things were better left buried. She'd known this moment was coming, had probably been preparing for it since the day she'd arrived at Fort Harrison. Her departure during lunch hadn't been a panic reaction to unexpected circumstances. It had been the implementation of a carefully planned extraction protocol. Rodriguez found himself hoping that she'd had enough warning to disappear completely, to find whatever safety existed for someone in her situation. He also found himself wondering what kind of world they lived in, where dedicated soldiers could be hunted by their own government simply for trying to escape from classified operations that had consumed their identities and their lives. Miles away, Paige sat in her car at Rally Point Delta, watching the access road for signs of the extraction team that would help her disappear once again. The location was a abandoned truck stop, the kind of place where transient travelers came and went without attracting attention or leaving lasting memories in the minds of casual observers. She'd used the 90-minute drive to mentally catalog everything that would need to be abandoned along with the Paige Lawson identity. The small apartment she'd rented off base, with its carefully chosen furnishings that suggested a modest lifestyle and conventional interests. The bank account that contained her military pay and nothing else that might raise questions. The few casual acquaintances she'd made, people who knew her only as a quiet soldier who kept to herself. Most painful of all, she'd have to abandon the sense of normalcy she'd discovered during her time at Fort Harrison. For 6 weeks, she'd experienced what it meant to be an ordinary person with ordinary concerns, someone whose greatest responsibility was ensuring that weapon inventories balanced correctly at the end of each shift. That life was now gone, as completely as if it had never existed, another casualty of the classified world that seemed determined to reclaim her regardless of her own preferences. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted her melancholy reflection. 2 black sedans pulled into the truck stop, their occupants invisible behind tinted windows until the doors opened to reveal 4 individuals who moved with the controlled precision that marked them as professionals. They approached her vehicle with weapons concealed but readily accessible, their body language indicating readiness for trouble while hoping not to find it. "Crosswind?" the lead figure asked, a woman in her 30s with short blonde hair and eyes that missed nothing in their immediate environment. "Confirmed," Paige replied, stepping out of her car and automatically assuming the posture that indicated cooperation rather than resistance. These people weren't enemies, but they also weren't friends. They were part of the machinery that served people like Colonel Whitmore, professionals whose job was to handle situations that couldn't be addressed through normal channels. "We need to move quickly," the woman continued. "Intelligence indicates that hostile assets are already mobilizing to locate you. Extended exposure at this location compromises everyone's security." Paige nodded and gathered her go-bag from the car, leaving behind a vehicle that had served Paige Lawson's transportation needs but would be useless to whoever she became next. As she approached the lead sedan, she found herself looking back toward Fort Harrison one final time, wondering if Captain Rodriguez would face consequences for his decision to give her warning about Colonel Whitmore's investigation. The man had shown her kindness and professional courtesy when he could have simply followed regulations and reported her suspicious identification card. His choice to remain silent, and later to facilitate her escape, represented the kind of moral courage that was becoming increasingly rare in their profession. She hoped that his superiors would recognize his actions as errors in judgment, rather than evidence of active conspiracy. As the convoy pulled away from the truck stop, beginning another journey toward another carefully constructed identity. Paige found herself wondering whether the cycle would ever end. How many times would she be forced to abandon lives she'd tried to build, always staying one step ahead of people who viewed her as an asset too valuable to lose? How many identities would she burn through before finding one that would allow her to simply fade into the background and live whatever remained of her natural life? The woman in the passenger seat turned to address her with the kind of neutral professionalism that characterized all interactions in their world. Your new documentation will be ready in 48 hours. Clean background, different military occupational specialty, transfer orders to a location where your skills won't be immediately recognizable. What location? Paige asked, though she suspected the answer would be somewhere equally isolated and temporary. Alaska, the woman replied. Remote radar installation with minimal personnel and maximum distance from anyone who might recognize your operational history. You'll be a communications specialist with a unremarkable service record and no unusual qualifications. Alaska represented exile more than refuge, a place where the cold and isolation would match the emotional landscape she'd been inhabiting for months. But it also offered something that had become precious: distance from the people who couldn't allow her to exist independently of their strategic interests. As the convoy traveled toward whatever facility processed people who needed to disappear, Paige allowed herself one final thought about the life she was leaving behind. Captain Rodriguez would probably face an investigation into his handling of her false identification, but his genuine ignorance about her real background would likely protect him from serious consequences. The other personnel at Fort Harrison would wonder briefly about the supply specialist who'd vanished during lunch break, then forget about her as new assignments and routine duties occupied their attention. In time, even the memory of Paige Lawson would fade, becoming just another footnote in the personnel records of people who'd served briefly and moved on to other duties. The identity would join the growing collection of lives she'd inhabited and abandoned, each one representing another attempt to escape the gravity of her operational past. But perhaps Alaska would be different. Perhaps the distance and isolation would finally provide enough separation from her previous life to allow some kind of permanent peace. Perhaps the cold would freeze the memories that continue to surface despite her efforts to bury them, and the endless darkness of Arctic winter would provide the kind of anonymity that remained elusive in more populated DAs. Locations. As the lights of Fort Harrison disappeared behind them, Paige settled back in her seat and began the mental process of becoming someone new once again. Tomorrow, she would study the documentation that would transform her into a communications specialist with no remarkable history or unusual skills. She would memorize a new biography, practice new mannerisms, and prepare to inhabit another carefully constructed persona. But tonight, for just a few more hours, she could allow herself to remember what it had felt like to be Paige Lawson, supply specialist, whose greatest concern was whether the rifles were properly secured in their racks. It had been a good life, however brief, and worth the price she'd paid to experience it. The convoy continued through the darkness, carrying its passenger toward another beginning in a series that seemed destined to continue indefinitely. Behind them, Fort Harrison settled into its normal evening routine, its personnel unaware that their facility had been touched by the shadow world of classified operations and emerged fundamentally unchanged. In his office, Captain Rodriguez worked late into the night, completing incident reports and preparing for the investigation that would inevitably follow Colonel Whitmore's visit. He'd made his choice to protect someone who'd trusted him with her secret, and he was prepared to accept whatever consequences that decision might bring. As he locked the armory for the night and began his walk across the darkened base, Rodriguez found himself thinking about the woman he'd known as Paige Lawson. Whatever her real name and background might be, she'd been a good soldier during her time under his command. Professional, reliable, and dedicated to performing her duties with competence and integrity. In a world where such qualities were becoming increasingly rare, he hoped she would find whatever peace was possible for someone carrying the burden of legends and secrets. And perhaps, in some distant future, she would finally be able to exist as herself, rather than as another carefully constructed identity designed to keep dangerous knowledge safely buried. The story of Crosswind would continue, but the chapter that had briefly intersected with his life was now closed, leaving behind only the memory of quiet competence and the knowledge that some secrets were indeed worthy keeping. In the end, that might be enough to justify the choices he'd made and the consequences he would face. The armory stood empty and silent, its weapons secured, and its secrets temporarily safe, waiting for whatever tomorrow would bring to the endless cycle of military routine and classified operations that shaped their world.